Hello and welcome to Learning with CS Anand Tinkani, and in the part 2 of the Takeover Regulation series. And in this part, we are going to cover Regulation 3 and Regulation number 4. The most important part of the Takeover Regulation is the trigger. If there is any confusion in this particular regulation, or particularly Regulation 3, your entire understanding of Takeover Regulation becomes fractured. 4 is pretty much simple. We'll spend most of our time in Regulation number 3. So just see this. You have regulation number 3, subregulation 1, which says that no acquirer shall acquire shares or voting rights. Now understand regulation 3, the heading says substantial acquisition of shares or voting rights. Now understand this part. Regulation number 3, this talks about shares and voting rights. Regulation number 4 talks about control, right? So when you are reading regulation number 3, understand the two things are there. One is the shares, the other is the voting right. What does regulation 3 says? Regulation 3 says that suppose this is the shareholding line of the company. So this is 0 to 100. Regulation 3.1 comes here. This is 25%. Okay, this is the zone of 3.1. Regulation 3.1 says that you are holding some shares, right? So there is some pre-acquisition shares. Then you are doing the acquisition of some shares. If this becomes equal to, or if this exceeds 25%, in that case, regulation 3, subregulation 1 gets triggered and you will attract the obligation to give the open offer. That is like how I said in the public in the previous video with respect to the open offer, that you need to give the public announcement. So the obligation to give the public announcement comes here as soon as your aggregate, because your pre-acquisition holding and your acquisition, this is your total, this is your aggregate holding. If your aggregate holding is equal to 25% or it exceeds 25%, then in that case, regulation 3, subregulation 1 is attracted. But what? It is the voting rights. You may acquire shares, you may acquire voting rights. But what is the triggering event? The triggering event is the voting rights. If your voting rights is 25% or more, then only your trigger is attracted. Okay, or the trigger is touched and the public announcement obligations get attracted. Just read this once again. I mean, I haven't read it once, but just read it once. You will be 100% clear about this part. So no acquirer shall acquire. So what does it say? No acquirer. It starts with no acquirer. Okay, so it's a negative sentence, but let's start reading it from here. So unless the acquirer makes the public announcement of an open offer for acquiring the shares of such target company in accordance with these rules. So regulation 3, subregulation 1 is telling the acquirer that unless you make the public announcement, unless you do this public announcement thing, don't acquire. So now you will be able to connect. So no acquirer shall acquire shares or voting rights in the target company, which taken together with the shares or voting rights, if any, held by him and by person acting in concert with him in such target company. Now, what is the event when regulation 3.1 gets attracted? If it entitles them to exercise 25% or more of the voting rights in such target company. So the triggering event is what? The triggering event is your aggregate voting rights in the target company is what? It is 25%. So this is 3.1. Pretty much simple. In exam, you may get some questions that the shareholding earlier was 2%, then some corporate restructuring or something happened and now it is 24% or 20% is being acquired. Is the trigger touched? Answer is no. Up till 24.99%, the trigger is not touched. But once you cross 25 or once you hit 25, the trigger will automatically get touched and you will have to give the open offer, right? So up to 24.99, there is no problem. But the moment you hit 25 or above, in this case, regulation 3, subregulation 1 gets attracted. You may hold 0. You straight away acquired 23%. Is there a problem? Answer is no. You hold 0. You acquire 28%. Is there a problem? Yes. 3.1 is attracted. You were holding, let's say, 3%. You acquired 22%. Is there a problem? Yes. 3.1 gets attracted, because in each of the case, like in this case, your aggregate is more than 25. In this case, it is exactly 25. And in this case, it was less than 25. So no acquirer who together with person acting in concert with him has acquired and holds. Okay, sorry, this is subregulation 2. This was subregulation 1, which says 3.1, and this is 3.2. Now in 3.2, like this is the most important part. What does 3.2 states? 3.2, if you see this, this is 3.2. This part. This part is 3.2. And in 3.2, you are going to get that no acquirer. So again, it starts with no acquirer, right? And you'll again get the same sentence. Unless the acquirer makes the public announcement of an open offer for acquiring shares of such target company in accordance with these regulations, no acquirer. Okay, so what it is restricting and when it is restricting, just check this. No acquirer who together with person acting in concert with him has acquired and holds in accordance with these regulations shares or voting rights in the target company, entitling them to exercise 25% or more of the voting rights in the target company, but less than the maximum permissible non-public shareholding. So what is maximum permissible non-public shareholding? This you are going to get it in SCRR, which is 75%. Okay, so a promoter or the promoter holding cannot go beyond 75, because that 25% minimum public shareholding that has to be maintained. Now in this case, what does it say? It says that the acquirer is already holding more than 25. Okay, the acquirer is already holding more than 25, but it is less than 75. This is the precondition. This is the precondition of 3.2. Just check. In case of 3.1, there was no precondition. What was the triggering event? It is after the acquisition, right? Post transaction. After the acquisition, the aggregate shareholding was being checked. But in this case, there is a precondition. And what is the precondition? That the acquirer is holding more than 25 or 25 or more, but it is less than 75%. Now, the acquirer is doing some acquisition. Okay. Now the acquirer is doing some acquisition, and this acquisition, if it is up to 5% in a financial year, up to 5%, there is again no problem. The trigger is not attracted. But if it is beyond 5%, more than 5%, then regulation 3, subregulation 2 is triggered. No acquirer who together with person acting in concert with him has acquired and holds in accordance with these regulations shares or voting rights in the target company, entitling them to exercise 25% or more of the voting rights in the target company, but less than maximum permissible non-public shareholding, shall acquire within any financial year additional shares or voting rights in such target company, entitling them to exercise more than 5% of the voting rights, unless you give the public announcement for the open offer. So first you give the public announcement for the open offer and then go and acquire more than 5% in a financial year. This restriction is applicable only to those acquirers who are holding more than 25 or more, but less than 75. Now regulation 3, subregulation 2. I hope this must be clear. What you need to see is the pre-holding, and then you need to see what they are acquiring. We don't have to see the total. Okay. In regulation 3, subregulation 1, we were checking only the total. What was relevant was the total. But in regulation 3, subregulation 2, the total is irrelevant. What is relevant is what is the pre-holding. Pre-holding decides the eligibility, and then the acquisition decides whether the open offer is to be given or not. So in case of acquisition, if it is up to 5%, there is no problem. If it is more than 5%, or I say if it is beyond 5%, in that case, you need to give the public announcement for the open offer. Right? So this is regulation 3, subregulation 2. But this regulation comes up with two relevant proviso. One more proviso is there, but that is not relevant as of now. So there are two provisos and there are two explanations to this. So let's understand each of them carefully, because you may get an exam question out of these four. So what does it say? The first proviso says that provided such acquirer shall not be entitled to acquire or enter into an agreement to acquire shares or voting rights exceeding such number of shares as would take the aggregate shareholding pursuant to the acquisition above the maximum permissible non-public shareholding. So we know that 25% minimum public shareholding is to be maintained. So if you are entering into the agreement. So see, this was 0 to 25. This was which zone? This was regulation 3 sub-regulation 1 zone. Once you are at 25 or above, your regulation 3 sub-regulation 2 zone starts, and it has a cap. The cap is at 75. So once you are in this zone, you can acquire up to 5% in a financial year. There is no problem. If you want to acquire more than 5%, again, there is no problem. Give the public announcement. But you cannot enter into any transaction which will take your aggregate holding to more than 75. So for example, you are already holding, let's say, 70% shares in the target company. Now you want to enter into an agreement of 10%, and then you say, I will give a public announcement. So takeover regulations would say, sorry, you cannot acquire this 10%. Why? Because if you acquire this 10%, your aggregate shareholding will go beyond 75%, which is actually not allowed in PSE to enter into any agreement which the acquisition. So there is another exception to that. If this acquisition is pursuant to a resolution plan which is approved by the NCLT under the insolvency bankruptcy code, then in that case, you are exempt from this 75% thing. Then you can go beyond. So for example, there is a company which is under CIRP, a resolution plan has been approved, and pursuant to that resolution plan, you want to acquire, let's say, 80% voting rights in the target company. Then in that case, this is not going to be a hurdle. You can definitely acquire more than 75%. So this part is provided further that acquisition pursuant to resolution plan approved under section 31 of the IBC shall be exempt from the obligation under the proviso to subregulation 2 of regulation 3. Understand, it does not exempts you from the trigger. It only exempts the proviso. The exemption is only with respect to the proviso here. Then there is first explanation. The explanation says that only take into consideration the gross acquisition. Now, what does this gross acquisition means? For example, in a financial year, I can acquire additional 5%, okay, without attracting the obligation to the open offer. Now, for example, I acquired 3%. I'm already holding, let's say, 28% at the beginning of the financial year. I acquired 3%. I sold 3%. Then again, I acquired 3%, and then I sold 3%. For example, I just presume that I just entered into these 4 transactions. Now, when I have entered into just these 4 transactions, my gross acquisition is what? 6%. My gross acquisition is 6%, and my gross disposal is what? My gross disposal is also 6%. So I acquired 6, I sold 6. What is my net acquisition? My net acquisition is 0. At the end of the day, I am still at the same place where I was at the beginning of the financial year. But have I triggered? The answer is yes, I have triggered, because 28% is the eligibility part. Remember, I said this is the eligibility part. So since I'm holding 28%, now I am eligible. But when I have to count how many additional shares I have acquired, takeover regulation says that you acquired 3% twice. So you have acquired 6. And then you tell to the takeover regulation, see, but I've also disposed those 6%, right? I've also disposed those 6%, 3% I disposed it here, 3% I disposed it here. So I acquired 6, but I've also disposed of 6. Therefore, my net acquisition is 0. But the takeover regulation would say, sorry, you can absolutely ignore this part. It's not relevant. What is relevant is what you have actually acquired. So while taking into consideration the trigger, only consider the gross acquisition. Do not consider the fall. For example, shares are being allotted to some other person and your shareholding goes down, and then you again acquire. So for example, my stake was 35%, right? I have not acquired any shares, but there was, let's say, a rights issue. I did not participate in that rights issue. Now my stake goes down to, let's say, 27%. Okay. So I was at 35. Now my stake goes down to 27%. Thereafter, after rights issue. And now I say that, okay, let me go back to 35 and I acquire 8% so that I can reach to 35%. Is there a problem? Answer is yes. Why? Because SEBI will only take into consideration these 8%. SEBI will say that we are not bothered with the fall of 8%. We are only concerned with the acquisition, what you have acquired. So you have acquired 8% and therefore gross acquisition of 8% will be taken into consideration, even though your aggregate holding at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year is exactly same. The second explanation is actually connected to this part, and it says that whenever the new shares are being issued, okay, whenever the new shares are issued, what you have to see is the difference between the post issue and the pre-issue. Just check the difference between the post issue and the pre-issue. This is going to be your additional voting rights that you have acquired. So if let's say new shares are allotted, so let's take an example. There are 100 shares. Out of these 100 shares, you are already holding 60. So what is your voting right in the company? It is 60%. Now let's presume company comes up with the preferential allotment, and in the preferential allotment, company issues 50 shares. Out of those 50 shares, let's say 30 shares are issued to you, right? So now the total shares in the company is 150. Your stake is 90. Your voting right is what? It is 60%. So have you acquired any voting right? Answer is no. Have you acquired shares? Answer is yes. But have you acquired any voting right? Answer is no, because earlier also your pre-issue voting rights in the company was 60%, and your post-transaction voting rights is what? It is 60%. So what is the additional voting right that you have acquired? It is 0%. So always check the difference between the pre and the post issue, and that will be considered as the additional voting right. If that's 0, well and good. If it is negative, you can ignore. If it is positive, then you have to test whether it is cumulatively more than 5% in a financial year or not. So for example, if a preferential allotment takes place and in that I have acquired 4% voting right, and sometime in the same financial year I had also acquired 2% from the market. Now in this case, what is the additional voting right that I have acquired? I have acquired 6%. Now I cannot say, see, preferential allotment mein to mere ko 4% hi mila. Sorry, SEBI will say you have to see in a financial year. So in a financial year, you did 2 acquisitions. One was pursuant to the preferential allotment where you got 4% voting right, and second is pursuant to the market purchase where you got 2%, and now your stake is 6%. Therefore, you have to give the public announcement for the open offer. Now, regulation 3, sub-regulation 3, everything is same. Okay, regulation 3, sub-regulation 3, everything is same, except you have to check it only from the acquirer point of view. Till now, what we were doing, we were seeing the acquirer and PAC collectively, right? We check this way. For example, this is the acquirer, this is the PAC. The acquirer acquired, let's say 20%, the PAC acquired, let's say 10%. So collectively, they have acquired 30%. And in this case, we say regulation 3, sub-regulation 1 is attracted. But now in this example, regulation 3, sub-regulation 3, what is going to change? Take it this way. The acquirer is holding, let's presume, 23%, and the PAC is holding, let's presume, 7%. Okay. Here they had acquired. Okay. Here the acquirer had acquired 20%. The PAC acquired 10%. So acquirer said that, see, I have not touched the 3-1 trigger. Why? Because I am at 20, which is less than 25. The PAC says that, please don't even come near to me because I am way below the 25% threshold. SEBI will say, sorry, both of you are acting collectively. So we will see what the acquirer has acquired, what PAC has acquired. Both of you have now acquired 20 plus 10, 30%. Therefore, 3-1 is attracted. But in this case, I am saying that they are already holding. Okay. They are already holding 23% plus 7%. So what is their total holding? Their total holding is 30%. This means they fall into the category of 3-2 because their pre-holding is 30%. Now, in a financial year, they are allowed to acquire 5%. So 5% shares were acquired by the PAC. So the PAC stake goes to 12%. The acquirer stake goes to 23%. And in the end, they are holding 35. So again, there is no problem because collectively in this year, they have acquired 5% only. Even though only PAC is acquired, we'll say collectively they have acquired only 5%. But here is a catch. If I just reverse this transaction, instead of the PAC acquiring 5%, here the acquirer has acquired 5%. So this is 28% and 7, 35. So everything remains same except that instead of PAC now acquirer has acquired. Now in this case, even though collectively they have not hit the trigger, but acquirer has individually hit the trigger. Acquirer has individually hit the trigger. And here we will say regulation 3, sub-regulation 3, read with regulation 3, sub-regulation 1, acquirer individually has hit the trigger, and therefore the acquirer will have to give the public announcement for the open offer. Here the obligation won't lie on the PAC. Throughout the takeover regulation, whatever acquisition obligation is there on the acquirer, the same obligation would be there on the person acting in concert. But regulation 3, sub-regulation 3 is the only exception where acquirer, PAC, whether every individual would be tested on the individual basis, or every person will be tested on the individual basis. I hope this must be clear. Just read this part and you will get a absolute clarity on this part. So for the purpose of sub-regulation 1 and sub-regulation 2, acquisition by any person. Now you see, now it does not say acquirer or it does not say PAC. It says by any person, such that their individual shareholding of such person acquiring the shares exceeds the stipulated threshold shall also be attracting the obligation to make an open offer for acquiring shares of the target company, irrespective of whether there is a change in the aggregate shareholding with the person acting in concert or not. So I hope this part is also clear to you. By the way, there is one amendment in regulation number 3. Wherever you have seen 25%, okay, just change it to 49% if the company is listed on the IGP platform. I'll show you the takeover regulation. So this is the takeover regulation, and what does the takeover regulation say? Sub-regulation 5. For the purpose of this regulation, any reference to 25% in case of, sorry, I think I haven't shared the screen. Yeah. So sub-regulation 5 says that for the purpose of this regulation, any reference to 25% in case of listed entity which has listed its specified securities on the innovators growth platform shall be read as 49%. So consequently, whatever 25% the trigger is, it will become 49% for the companies which are listed on the IGP platform. And like, for example, regulation 4, what I said, it's a very simple regulation. Regulation 4 says that irrespective of the acquisition or holding of shares or voting rights, no acquirer shall acquire directly or indirectly control over the target company. So if you get control over the target company, then in that case, the trigger is being attracted. And before you acquire that control, you have to give the public announcement for the open offer. So that's what is there in regulation number 3 and regulation number 4. I hope the illustrations of regulation 3 are clear to all of you. And this is the heart and soul of regulation, the entire takeover regulations. So in the next video, I will be covering the delisting offer, which is actually the amendment, regulation 5. The entire regulation 5 is being replaced, and that, sorry, regulation 5A, and the entire regulation 5A is being replaced, and I will be covering that in the next lecture.